Well, thank you all for coming. It's a privilege to be able to talk with you about concerns that I think are important to all of us. And I'm trying to connect up, of course, what do we learn from sacred scripture, a tradition that's been handed on by our ancestors for over 2 to 3 millennia, and how does that impact the way we live? And so the title that I gave to this was Truth-Telling, Prophecy, and Testimony. And it's really an area of sort of practical decision-making or practical ethics. And so hopefully you will have questions as we go along. And whenever they come up, please don't hesitate to interject. And we will try and deal with it there. That helps me to get a sense of, am I talking to the wind or am I talking to you? And I get a sense of where you're at in this. So where I'd like to begin is with a section from Psalm 40. And Psalm 40 is a hymn of thanksgiving, which I think when we think of our Christian life, especially Christian life across the denominations, particularly within Roman Catholicism, has to do with Eucharist, which is thanksgiving. And so why is thanksgiving or being grateful so central to the way we live our lives? And that's what I hope to unfold that in its various dimensions as we move through this. So I'll just start with Psalm 40, which is a psalm of thanksgiving. I waited and waited for the Lord, who bent down and heard my cry, drew me out of the pit of destruction, out of the mud of the swamp, set my feet upon a rock, steadied my steps, and put a new song in my mouth, a hymn to our God. Many shall look on in awe, and they shall trust in the Lord. Happy are those who trust in the Lord, who turn not to idolatry or to those who stray after falsehood. How numerous, O Lord my God, you have made your wondrous deeds, and in your plans for us there's none to equal you. Should I wish or to declare or tell them, they're too many to count. So I think those first 6 verses capture a lot of the sentiment, what this psalmist is doing is, obviously, a person has just been pulled up out of a very overwhelming kind of sense of death-like, some sense of new life that's coming forward to this person. And it's that dying and rising experience, which of course is what we commemorate in the Eucharist, and that we join ourselves, which then joins us not only to the members that are gathered there in that assembly, but it actually gathers us to all peoples that are that God is trying to bring into the divine life. So there's a grand mystery that's operative here, and it takes us, well, clearly a lifetime to live into that reality. But I think even at the earliest stages of our life journey, we get at least an intuitive sense that there's something bigger going on here in the midst of this. So these Psalms of Thanksgiving, the other one that I want to, it connects up, this psalm at the end of it goes back into a lament, which probably tells us a lot about life. You know, we get raised up and then something comes along and we go back down again and we have to come back up again. in the process. So the one I would like to look at right now, very briefly, you're all familiar with this, I'm sure. It's Psalm 22. And of course, Jesus praised this at the time he's being crucified. My God, why have you abandoned me? Or why have you forsaken me? And that communicates to us a sense of the humanity of Christ. How the humanity and the divinity come together is a mystery. We don't know the exact connection to that. But what our tradition has encouraged us to stay with is do not undercut either of those. And I think our tendency is, well, Jesus is God. Well, he saw through all of this and he knew what the outcome was. So his level of anxiety at the time he's up on the cross, he's just saying those words. It's not what he's experiencing. Our tradition says absolutely not. And in fact, they're arguing as we go, the various voices in the tradition are arguing that if Jesus did not go through the full extent of human experience and that darkness, that we would not be rescued by what he has done, which is the wonder of the incarnation. And actually, when you think even of the creation, why did this supreme being or this God or this origin of everything that we believe in, posit, etc., however we stand on that, but this personal origin of everything that exists, this person, this divine reality, this mystery is not simply a power or a force, but is a person that is in charge and can see, can do whatever, is, in other words, sovereign over everything. But at the same time, while this God is enthroned up there, is one who looks down on all that's been created and cares for it. So it's that double sense of being capable of doing what needs to be done to create wholeness, and the sense that this God really does want to do that. But for the integrity of our own being as free individuals who need to choose at crucial points, God will not force us to be following the pathway that God has opened up to us through Christ. But there you have God manifesting the wonder of the divinity by being the creator, but also becoming fully part of human life. So the incarnation, taking on flesh in that sense. So we know what I've mapped out there. Whenever you get into a situation that seems to disprove one of those things, that God is capable of doing whatever, and God is compassionate, and then you see, well, why do bad things happen to good people? It looks like something is not in order, doesn't make sense. And the key example of that, of course, is Job. And as we read through that whole Joban story, the first 2 chapters give us a sort of overview, set the context as an introduction. And we see there, it's a heavenly scene. And this one character comes through who is called the Satan. It actually means a prosecuting attorney, rather than what we in the later tradition talk about as the prince of devils or Satan. But this attorney is saying, oh, you think Job is so faithful and that he will stay with you no matter what. And he says, but look, you know, you've given him wealth. He has abundance of belongings to him. He's got He's got a wonderful family, and his health is good. Well, why wouldn't he pay attention to you? He's getting something out of it, which of course is very human. You know, why should I invest in this if it's not gonna make any difference? So the test there for Job is to see, is his fidelity, his obedience, his acknowledgement, his worship of God, is it disinterested in the sense that I'm going to do this because it's what's right, it's what I can see it's the order of things, or is he doing it just because he gets something, he gets rewards? So the Satan comes in and says, well, let me test him first. And God says, well, you take it easy on him a little bit anyway, not easy, but you can go ahead and take his property away, and you can take his family, which is very tragic, of course. Those two things happen to Job, and Job says, God has given and God has taken away. Blessed be God. So we get the image of Job as Job the patient, the one who stays with it and endures whatever tragedies, catastrophes can happen in human life. The Satan comes back and he says, well, let me try one more thing. Let me afflict him with, and so we know that Job gets these sores, he gets very uncomfortable, painful kinds of afflictions. And at that point, Job still, you know, he hangs in there. Of course, he's crushed in the sense life is going. Then this first two chapters, which are written in prose, then we move into poetry. And the poetry of that is a lament. It's a series, it's the genre of that, or the kind of the ways that Job speaks there. It's as if he's expressing this lament that we find at least in 1/3 or more of the Psalms in the Psalter, which are giving us language for when we get into situations that just confuse us. The world that we've been investing in, counting on, in the sense that God is in charge, capable, and if I complain to God, God will respond and heal me or bring me out of this. The lament, especially when things are really dark, the lament is saying these pieces do not fit together. And your sense of, is there actually a God out there? Is this whole thing run by anonymous forces? At that point, what makes Job hang on is that he is in, the lament form says you ought to express your anger, your confusion, whatever, you need to voice that. And so those lament psalms actually give us language. And when you think about Job, or when you think about Jesus on the cross, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? That is traditional language that was in that psalm all the way along. And Jesus is showing us that that's why it's there, is to help us to somehow hang on when things are really, really dark. And there's something about, you know, when you get crushed, you really are in silence. Job's friends, when they come by to see him, their first reaction is to spend about 7 days just sitting next to him in silence. So they know anything they say is going to be, it's not adequate. In fact, what you would say actually would be harmful, because we ourselves would feel vulnerable and probably want to protect our own sense of how the world fits together. And so probably a more automatic reaction of a human would be to say, to try and put some rationality into this and say, and maybe say, well, you can go forward if you do this. Job's friends, through the next middle part of that book, from chapter 3 all the way up to chapter 36, his friends tried to supply him with a whole set of traditional explanations. And what it boils down to is they're saying, Job, you think you're innocent, but you must have done something to really trigger this. You may not be aware of it, but it's probably there. And if you own up to it, then God will be kind and compassionate and come back and restore you. What's very interesting is when you get to the final chapter of the book of Job, and it goes back into prose, but Job gets restored. But the interesting piece in there is that God says to the friends, and he had 3 friends that were really the ones that he was going back and forth with. He says, now do you see how you were in the wrong by trying to explain and put some kind of explanation on why these 3 catastrophes happened to Job? So Job is vindicated. And I think one of the things we need to draw from this is that when we get into those human situations that are very confusing and we can't make sense, if God is God, we can't make sense out of why this has occurred. What those Psalms are they're put before us and they're saying, pray these, use the language of this, because praying this is an act of faith on your part in which you say, I know, God, that you're capable of responding. And I'm not sure why you're holding off. Why won't you come and do some restoration here? But the important thing is that in the deepest darkness, I am not cutting off my connection with this God. And I still have the sense that there's something deeper here that I can't see at this point in time. So the lament psalms, I think, are really important for us. And our tradition lost these. You know, they get buried. Think of how many times you've read lament psalms. Maybe great if you have, in the sense of being aware of them. But in our liturgies, they don't show up as responsorial psalms very often at all. And it's within the Jewish tradition, they had more of a place, but it's the attitude that comes through there is to be honest to God. Don't cover this over by sort of, you've got to let the fullness of your experience be part of this relationship with God. And most of us, I think, were probably raised, when you go to church, you be on your best behavior. And don't you start using this kind of language that's going to go after God and say, God, you're vicious, why did you do this? You're betraying. The lament psalms use that kind of language. Some are more angry, vitriolic than others, but some get pretty negative. And we are given this language so that when our own experience resonates with that, it can help us to move forward, to survive, etc. And even in our office, the way it's set up, we end up having a lament psalm sprinkled through each of them. So we're praying these things when individually, that's not where I'm at. Things are going pretty well, but I pray this psalm. Why would we do that? And over the years, we would, at our noon prayer, which was really short, and we would have visitors come in. And every once in a while, Psalm 137 would show up. When you get to the end of Psalm 137, it's like dashing the babies on the rock of these people that have injured us. And here you have all these monks up there praying, and let them dash their babies on the rock. Well, there was a question as to whether that's what we wanted to leave with this short sort of prayer sermon. The problem with, we did take it out of there. We didn't pray that publicly. But the problem with that is it actually, if you want to argue the other side that you should keep it in there, what it does is it makes us mindful of the people in the world that are having these really, really devastating experiences. And over the past few years, for example, when we had all these images about the war in Syria, and you'd see these places bombed out and people going out of the country into refugee camps, etc. What was their experience like? And so the promise, or at least the potential of these lament psalms, like Psalm 137, is it will make me mindful of those people and intercede on their behalf. So there's certain solidarity that comes with the peoples throughout the world by praying this whole range of psalms that we have here, from laments, which are really the central one, because you get a sort of pendulum which moves from, it starts out brokenness, but then it rises up and you get people praying into the heights of heaven on this, that things have really, really been brought together. So the lament psalm includes both the dying experience of us and the rising, which is why this Psalter is so central, I think, for Christian communities, is that it gets that Paschal mystery. And within our tradition, the Paschal mystery, if you recall going to the Easter Vigil and they sing the Exultet, and there's a phrase in there that probably has jarred most of us at some time when it says, "Oh happy fault, oh necessary sin of Adam," which then puts that whole sense of how things are out of joint within our world, within our experience. It puts it in a different context. If we're saying, why would that be good? You know, it seems like we want to get that brokenness out of the world, get it out of our experience. But what it's saying is that what this fault, this transgression of the original human couple in some idyllic utopian garden setting, what that transgression did is it brought forth this Redeemer. And what the Redeemer brings into our sphere of experience, the potential, is so much greater than going back to that garden. So a lot of us probably would think, well, if we get redeemed, we get restored, we're going back to that utopian harmony that's pictured there. That's not the Christian view. Certainly, harmony and wholeness comes, but it's drawing us into a mystery that's much greater than that. So when Christ comes, what's Christ doing? What would, I assume, if maybe you've gone through this before, but I always thought, well, Christ comes and he's going to restore us and we're going to be happy. Things are going to be back together again. I'd say, well, if we read the tradition and that, oh, happy fault, exulted him, it's saying, no, it's not that. We may get restored, but that's not sufficient. So what is the coming of Christ doing for human beings? Don't be shy. I want to see people. Yeah, please. Okay. Okay, so we in a sense then we walk along in Galilee with all the disciples, and we're here when we read the Gospels and we hear the teachings, but we not only get his admonitions or his parables, etc., which enlighten us and challenge us, but we also get his example. Yeah, he's leading us. I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do, which is really, I think, very, very compelling in the sense that God could have put everything back together. Boom, you repent, boom. But God did not do that. God came, and the divine reality goes through the fullness of the human experience, and which makes, what it does is it says this journey that we make where things seem at times this is meaningless or this is going nowhere. What that experience of Christ going through that, of God, the Trinitarian God going through that kind of experience with us, is he's saying that has meaning. That has meaning. How could it have meaning? Seems just like it's painful to me. Please.
What it says to me, when I go through pain in my life where I've had difficult times, that I just feel like I'm surrendering. But what it does is it has, I guess my faith has done this to me. It has meant to me, this is an opportunity for evolving into something greater, and to take that as, in a sense, it's hard to say this, but bad things that happen to good people, it's good for bad. The bad things sometimes are good because they help us go beyond and get to the place where he really wants us to get to.
Okay.
But we have to be able to experience those things and use them in that way, I believe.
Yeah, okay, good, great. So it's what you're pointing to is it's not enough for my parents or my elders or someone who's gone through this to tell me that you'll become a better person by persevering and going through this. But their words have more authority if they have done this. And you see what's happening as you're pointing towards. There's a kind of formation, a kind of discipline that brings us into this larger reality of which fundamentally I think is how our life is joined with that of God. And somehow, unless we bodily go through this sense of being pushed to the limits, it just remains a nice idea. It's abstract, etc., which is not part of our tradition. Our tradition is saying it's what we go through, and our journey is the way we come to know God. So you see the difference in the kind of knowing there. It's not just informational. It's like you know someone, and if you really know someone, you have a resonance with them in terms that's intuitive, it's feeling, it includes your whole person. So, yeah, please, Joe.
By becoming human, Christ brings us into the Godhead. He divinizes us.
Exactly. Yeah. And so my earlier question, what's the big deal about oh happy fault? The end point of that is that God has come in human form, become incarnate, and which we acknowledge and keep before us as we celebrate Eucharist, we give thanks, etc. And we know that St. Athanasius and other early Christian thinkers, theologians, etc., leaders of they were saying, we become what we eat. So if we're consuming the body and blood of Christ, we are becoming joined and actually being transformed into that Godhead, which, Joe, your point about being divinized, that has really been something that's been in the background. It never abandoned, say, the Western tradition that came up through St. Augustine and on into the West. He was sort of the big force in shaping theology that went through Western Europe and into our country. But Augustine was big into the fall. You know, that somehow original sin, that's what's put us in our, and so you spend all of your time thinking about how can I deal with that brokenness? And I need to be disciplined. If I don't have discipline in my life, that, you know, these disordered passions that are part of that experience, they're gonna probably take me down a route that's gonna be ruinous. And so I better be careful. And so you take the energy and the time that we have and you put it towards avoiding sin. If I do sin, I feel guilty, I gotta take care of that and move it, etc. All of those have their place, but they're not central. What's central is what God is inviting us into and is promising. This was more prominent, I would say, within the Eastern tradition, whether you go through Syriac Christianity or even into the Greek Orthodox. They would have lifted up this idea that when we participate in the mysteries, which refer to the sacraments, those mysteries are drawing us into the Godhead, to becoming part, that's where we talk about being, when we get baptized, we become children of God, daughters and sons of God. What that means, we're not just simply human at that point. We're there with Christ, and we have been on the way towards being divinized, which I think when I was raised, it was like, well, the original sin in the Garden of Eden, the problem there is humans wanted to take over God's place. They wanted to be God. And you're telling me that part of our tradition is saying that you are going to become like God, or you're going to be divinized? It seems, well, we're going down the pathway that's going to lead to arrogance. It's going to lead us in. But precisely the real key difference there is it's God doing this for us. God is transforming us. We are becoming in part of the divine life because of what God puts that life within us and changes us. It's not what I do. And that's where, when you think of the reality of original sin, it's undeniable that there's something out of joint within human experience, individually, communally, whatever. That out of joint is a reality that's around us, that we talk about the human condition, consequence of some primordial transgression. And that transgression probably can be summed up in the fact that human beings chose to try and they made a choice that when tempted, you're not going to die when you eat this fruit. You know, the owner of the garden said, don't eat it. But if you go ahead and eat it, what's going to happen to you is you're going to become like gods. And so we were tempted to take over. And that's the big difference in the transgression, is that we humans rebelled and chose not to let God be God, but we wanted to be in charge. And I think where you find this in our experience in a very common way is no one of us likes to be vulnerable to unpredictable, chaotic kinds of situations. And so pragmatically, it is important for us to try and think what's going to happen in the next year, 5 years, and sort of plan for this and do whatever we can to keep things going. There's some real legitimate and important decision making that goes on there. But where the problem comes in is if I start trusting that my security rests on if I have enough for my retirement and I have a pretty good IRA, or however we put this all together, that's what I trust in. That's what's going to keep me from being vulnerable. And usually what happens is in our own lives, I suspect, is that we never quite have enough security. We always need a bit more and a bit more. And so it's that effort, which I'm pointing to here, is that it's one important example in our experience of trying to gain security by something that we humans have created. When you think of money, there was a time when there weren't coins. First coins come around probably 400 BC. And all of a sudden at that point, if you are in a land where, most of you pay taxes. I probably pay them in a different way. But anyway, when you pay taxes and you have this authority that's over the land, etc. Well, if you got into a place where another country came in and took you over, and then they want the tribute, they want the taxes, they want that coming. When you get coins, you can set that as a very definite amount. And if it's $100 now is probably what it will be next year and the year after. Whereas previously, and most of these people were farmers, so sometimes your crops flourish, sometimes they go south. And if you're share farming with this overlord, that overlord has to take part of the hit. If it's a bad year, well, you get less, as I'm getting less. When you quantify this and put it into a monetary amount, if you get a bad crop, sorry, you got to pay what you paid last year in the good year. And so they begin, I'm just pointing towards how that monetary kind of economy became a way that it organized the social life and the community. What was happening in the few centuries before Christ and leading up to the time of Christ, why tax collectors are such hated ones, is that they were keeping this system alive that would siphon off wealth at an exorbitant amount. But what it was really doing was the whole system it was a tax collector, as we look upon as a traitor. It's somebody that it's one of our people that's going and is working for this overlord, and they come in and take our funds and give it to that overlord. But what's really offensive about that is that the impact of doing that is that it undermined the well-being of the families that were depending upon they couldn't give this away and still survive. So it began to undermine the family systems. And if you wanted to go back to what really was the major misstep, which I don't know if you can say that, but the whole creation of money became a reality that then the way it began to be used is it undermined family solidarity. Because typically what would happen within the Hebrew the ancient Israel, is that when I had a bad crop, hopefully there's somebody down the road or in the other part of the country that's going to help me, or at least in my clan, that we're in this together, and we need to look out for one another. So that sense of solidarity among the people of Israel was being weakened, undermined by this whole reality of money that could come, because you had people bailing out from the solidarity. We can't depend on this family system. That thing is not going to work anymore. And so that you began to trust, the only way to counter this is to make sure that I've got this pot of gold here. And the problem with the pot of gold is you never have enough in that pot. You just have to keep. And so, you think about, say, young people trying to decide what they want to do now. And, some can probably say, well, I'm going into this and it's going to be something that's going to stabilize my life. I'll have good finances when I come out of it. And it's rather than, sort of the traditional thinking back maybe a couple centuries or even this, you think of professions like medicine or even the clergy, and even those that were in sort of political or legal professions, that they were expected to make sacrifices. They went into this because the upshot of doing this, my goal is to help others and help the community, help what would be the common good. So it's, how did, what if somebody goes into a profession where I'm going into this because I know I'll make a lot of money, and that becomes my goal, etc. A lot of complexities. And I don't mean to be to oversimplify this, but just to point to the fact that one of the ways that our relationship with God gets distracted is by relying on things that are less than ultimate, and we treat them as if they are ultimate. This is the main thing. And so when I look at my week, my months, etc., and I assess whether this was worth it or not, or whether it's good, how do I measure that? And if I'm measuring it by making money, I probably am not tending to a lot of other things that would promote the common good within our communities, etc. So that would be labeled idolatry. And there is no easy solution to this, because when I harp on this whole question of where do you put your trust and your security, I know when I was in seminary and we were going through certain texts and we were just learning how to preach, and a fellow wanted to go out and say, I want to preach to the congregation that they should not have insurance. Well, fortunately, the instructor said, no, don't go that way. That's not very practical at all. And so there's this, what makes this challenging is that we have to make decisions on the basis of what's before me and keep asking, where is my anchor? What's my focus? What's my real trust? So if it is that, when a push comes to shove, if I've got enough control over material things that I can either take care of myself, or I can persuade others to do what I want. So it feeds into, obviously money can be a leverage point at which we exercise control over things, that I have more control if I have more of it. And I think at the bottom of our faith journey is that our confidence and our trust is in this relationship that God cares for me, and that even if I go through really broken times, God will be there, and that's what I'm being called into. And it's that relationship, which for us humans, that can be a real challenging thing to let go and trust in that relationship in that sense. Just one jump, I don't know if this helps, but people talk about doing a kind of centering prayer or quiet prayer where they just sit and sit and sit and hope for the presence of God to touch their inner heart, inner experience. I was reading an article here last week, and it's the person was saying, it's coming off this, I don't know if some of you have seen this Jesuit America media. It's sort of a daily kind of where the Jesuits are putting out it's actually very interesting. But one of these guys was saying that the reason we may resist that kind of sitting in quiet is that there may not be anybody there. And so our fear in doing that is a sense of the non-existence of this God, which the whole point of the incarnation of Jesus coming and working miracles, etc., is the point that the presence of God suffuses everything, and we may not pick up on it. Our antennae may not connect in with this, but God is there. And so I think the confusion and the fright of sitting in silence, and it seems like I'm just sitting here with myself. The problem is that it pushes us to the question of, am I alone? Is this being here? And that's the promise of our tradition, though, is that God is there. Even when you think you're sitting alone and you're abandoned, that abandonment is typically interpreted as God trying to urge us to keep seeking, keep coming back, that God is around us and through us, etc. So in a sense, when we think of Jesus rising from the dead and he goes down into Sheol, which means that he comes into relationship with everyone that's died and reestablishes a connection with the divine, and then rises up and is seated at the right hand of God. That doesn't mean that when God comes in the fullness at the end of time, that God is not here now, but rather that presence is surrounding us, etc. And I was reviewing a book here about 3-4 weeks ago, Gerhard Lofink. It's on the 40 parables of Jesus. Very interesting book. But what he's pointing out is that Jesus would say all these various parables that sort of made us, we wonder what, and usually what they do is he draws you into it and then twists it so that you have to ask a question about yourself in the process. The argument, or one of the main arguments of that book is that we may think of when Christ ascended into heaven, that Christ is off there, and the wholeness or the sharing the divine life is something that's going to come at the end. The whole argument of the parables is Jesus is trying to encounter us, and that the reign of God, the reality of God being around us is right here, right now, and that we should live into it. I found that very, very helpful as a way of going back and reading these parables and being encountered by them with a sense of what you call presence of the end time or present eschatology. Jesus, and it tells us something about who Jesus was, is that if you were walking with Jesus at that point, and And the way we walk with him when we read those texts and those parables is that Jesus wants us to encounter him as God in this engagement that he's. So the primary thing there is engagement, which I would argue is the opposite of being abandoned. And that engagement demands that we do something. We can't just be engaged if we don't choose. And so those parables keep calling us to a measure of engagement. And they don't just overwhelm us with something that's impossible. You know, listening to the parable and getting the point and having a sense that this is drawing me somewhere, these are sort of ongoing, more moderate, gentle ways of drawing us into connection with this God at that point. Okay? So one of my favorite Psalms is actually that one that Jesus prayed on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And why it's obviously the first part doesn't make me happy. You know, he's not only suffering a sense that God doesn't seem to be around, but the community, the images that you get of the community in that psalm, they're like wild bulls, lions, and dogs. Those three images of creatures, beasts that are devouring, is what surfaces when you think about Jesus' sense of abandonment is not just a sense of the absence of God, but rather it's also the community is alienated from him. And we can probably, we don't own up to this, but maybe we sense the truth of this, is that when someone is afflicted in a pretty catastrophic way, we wonder, in other words, a bad thing happening to good people, we wonder, you know, I could be in that situation. And so there's a certain protection that we try to come up with. And that's Job's friends try to use a theological tradition, at least to keep their head around this, and it protects them from a kind of conceptual or mental chaos that would invade. So they use that to try and convince Job, you have to own up that you did something wrong that triggered this. And so the whole principle, if you do good, you get rewarded. If you don't, you get punished. That principle can still hold. They want Job to admit that. Job's experience is saying that doesn't hold. It may hold 80% of the time, but there's a whole bunch of very important experiences that it doesn't hold. And we got to acknowledge that. The friends don't want, they feel vulnerable. You know, when you think of certain perhaps diseases that come along that are contagious or whatever, and we've gone through at least pandemic where we keep our distance and we try and protect ourselves, and that can carry over into a lot of others where we try to protect ourselves against these dangers, so we end up being hostile, perhaps in extreme cases, towards the one that's suffering, rather than compassionate, which seems pretty bestial. You know, it's like, and I've used in classes an example that I picked this up somewhere. You know, I'm a farm kid, and I did go through the chicken coop, etc., watching this. But I don't recall seeing this exactly. But if one of them goes down, they apparently go after it. And the same thing apparently happens with hogs. If one of them goes down, they will probably devour it. And so that kind of, the abbot had a reflection in this, Give Us This Day here last week. in which he was going the other direction. He was talking about a documentary and PBS, which said, and that one was talking about elephants. And when elephants, they will go back to where their previous generation had died and there are remains of it there, and the trunks are sort of connecting them back up with it. So he was trying to make the argument that we humans who remember our loved ones that pass on, that's part of the animal consciousness too. So I've got some work to do here to figure out why are elephants different from chickens or whatever. So, but that sense, the hostility, that's what's voiced in Psalm 22. And when you finally get to the end of this outpouring of anguish and complaint in the first part of that psalm, there's a petition, free me from the horns of these oxen, which are devouring. So the oxen are devouring. It's like they have the jaws of the lion. You get those things merged, and the hostility of dogs surrounding you. So all three of those hostile animals come together in that final petition. It's about verse 22, but fortunately we have another 10, 12 verses to go in Psalm 22, which go the exact opposite way. Something happens, and the psalmist then is confident that God is there. And so, when something really good happens to any one of us, I mean, really good, it's something that I'm just caught up in the wonder of what's occurred. I don't sit in my room and sort of, oh, this is great. But I run out and try and find somebody to tell them about it. And it's that kind of expression of thanksgiving, going out saying the wonderful thing that has happened in my experience, that in that psalm, it first extends to those around you. And you probably go into the worshiping assembly and give voice to it there. Then you proclaim it more, and it goes out to the country and to the ends of the earth. But this psalm doesn't stop there. It proclaims that dying, resurrecting experience that this person has gone through not only connects the person up with all of the people around that are there now, and with people geographically separated, it connects me with them. But he also starts talking about those who have died. It goes down into Sheol, and it connects us up with all those that have passed away, this rising experience. And he even goes so far as to say, those are yet to be born. It connects me up with them. So if we're trying to get into the heart of the dying and rising or the Paschal mystery, it is something that is promising communion with all of reality. It's bringing us into connection with all personal reality that is now, was, or will be, which is why, when I think about why, oh, happy fault, that's why it's happy fault. And that's, Joe, I think when it's say being divinized, that's what it's after. It's trying to bring us into that divine life, which we share in. And our sense is that that divine life is all around us. It's active, it's nurturing, it brings blessings to us that perhaps we don't quite recognize, or we might attribute them to something else, but it's that kind of divine active intervention in our lives that is what the whole Paschal mystery is up to. Yeah, Debbie.
too that Jesus is in becoming human, the very thing that we hold to be sacred, that Jesus dying on the cross, is showing us what it is like to be divine. It's not being king, it's being giving of ourselves. It's dying to the self, and in that way, serving others and helping the common good.
Exactly. Yes, yes. So, one sort of detour that our tradition made is that it talked about God as being perfect. And if God is perfect, then there can't be any movement of emotion. God knew it all beforehand. Therefore, there really is no sense of pain or anguish within the Godhead. God's perfect. That kind of change is at least it participates in what we call the reality of death, that things move from point A to. That's a Greek conception. And the Greeks, just one prime example of that is that when you go to Aristotle, he says that where everything came from was from this unmoved mover, which sounds pretty strange. But so in order to get things started, you have to have something that's going to sort of get it going. So you have to have a mover. But he says it's unmoved because God has to get the creation or the world going without changing. And so it's like the beauty of God then, or of this mover, the beauty of it attracted what was out there to move and come into being. But the problem with that is it infected the Christian tradition that went along. So you'll have someone like Saint Anselm in the 1100s saying that, God really didn't feel upset at this. The scripture may say that God was really angry, but that really is not that's not the reality of it. It's that God saw beyond this and didn't really, the world does not impact him that way. And it wasn't just 11th century. This one character that I believe I mentioned it in sort of the promotion of this talk was this Isaac the Syrian, who was a 7th century Syrian sort of a hermit, but a mystic, and really celebrated by that branch of Eastern Christianity. But he also was arguing that God is above and beyond being impacted by the world, which, I don't know, the way I was raised is that don't do this, you'll get God upset. So I really thought of God as a sort of human-like parent, but in the heart of the tradition, when they were talking about who God is that God was infinite, all-knowing. So we have those 4 O's. It's omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and there's one more. But anyway, all of those come together to have God being complete. And complete is perfect. But that image of God just doesn't fit especially with their scriptural tradition. It's no wonder that they, I teach Old Testament, so I have to defend it here at this point. But in the tradition, there was a thinker in the early centuries called Marcion, and what he wanted to do was to throw out the Old Testament, but he didn't stop there. He was going to hang on to like 10 chapters of Luke, which talked about this forgiving God, which are really beautiful and wonderful. But they wanted to take all of these images of God as being angry or having these human-like, he wanted to throw those out. And the church said, no way. because that's part of human experience. And we need to see how God was wrestling with that. Grace, how am I doing for time? I get lost in doing all this.
I love this kind of thing. I like to sit down with people and discuss in depth. One of the things that I was thinking of is St. John of the Cross, the Dark Night of the Soul. And I think if any of you have read or studied that kind of thing, I think we all have to go through a dark night of the soul in order to ascend to a higher place. And I think what I was trying to say before too is I've been broken a number of times in my life in some serious ways. I am so grateful that I had faith and trust in God to get me through those tough times. And getting through them, I was thinking when you talk about Christ going into Sheol, in a way, in a sense, we all do go down and descend into Sheol at times. The example of Christ moving out of that and rising again, that's where we want to be.
Yeah.
That's my lesson for that, for myself, is when I have had those times, I want to be able to descend into hell. I don't welcome that. Like Job, for example, was one of my favorite books. Certainly was distressed and really, I mean, I can't even begin to imagine having those things happen in your life.
Yeah.
But accepting that and moving through it and ascending out of that, in essence, Sheol for him. That is an example, I think, for us all to realize in our own lives when we have gone into that Sheol ourselves. That's kind of my feeling.
Yeah, great, exactly, yes. And I think going through that kind of dying experience ourselves helps us to be more compassionate to those that are around us that go through this kind of. So the other thing that I find about the Sheol experience is that, you know, when you recite the Apostles' Creed and Jesus descended to the dead or descended into hell, it was to reestablish the connection of those people who had died before, making the point that they were not abandoned, that they were sort of in this holding place. And when Christ comes, the presence of God is down there, which when you read through the Psalms, it says you have individuals who are in deep distress and you're bargaining with God. You know, if you take my life, the amount of praise you get is going to be a lot less. So you better take care of me if you want this. Because they're saying there is no praise that happens in Sheol, which that picture does not radically change, because we only get that little bit there and say the Apostles' Creed that's part of the tradition. But what it does say is that God goes down and is present there. And so it does affirm. There is one place in Psalm 139 which says, it talks about the omnipresence of God, and it goes from east to west to up and down, and it says God is in heaven and in the depths of Sheol. So that one is countering what would be otherwise in like Psalm 6 or whatever. But yeah, so to embrace all of experience, and how's that going to stretch us in the ways that we relate to one another in the process also. Yeah, please.
I'm having trouble being able to see, not being able to see God as perfect and emotionally changeable.
So you would say
I
it's-
think he can be perfect and,
yeah,
you
which
know,
I think you're in the heart of the tradition. That's the tradition is saying that also.
yeah,
What the critique is that if we relied upon Greek philosophy to tell us what this supreme being is like, we would try and get that emotional changing component out of it. Yeah,
Okay.
which was a distortion in the tradition. I don't
Okay.
how they navigated that, because they clearly had to pay attention to all those texts where God was getting furiously angry
Right,
and
right,
punishing
right.
and God rejoicing,
Right,
etc.
right.
So there's, yeah, good. I'm happy, or at least that's a good thing to see that the two fit together.
They can be,
Yeah,
they can be
yeah.
both.
Yeah, please. We have one right around the corner.
own experience. The vigil mass for Easter has a beautiful reading in the breviary from St. Ambrose,
Yeah,
where Jesus descends into hell in search of Adam.
okay.
And that just touches my heart every time I read
I
it.
think that's the exalted hymn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the one where the deacon is supposed to come out and sing that. If you aren't a singer, then when you're a deacon, you got a challenge there. Yes. Okay. How are we doing? All right. Well, we can continue on if that's what you want.
The idea of perfect is static. And as you mentioned, Greeks, I'm just thinking how, if it's static, it's hard to have some love being static because love moves about.
Yeah.
And the reason I thought of this is I have a granddaughter named Ronya, and my daughter and son-in-law are not religious people. So they named her after a character in a movie. But a friend found out this has some origin in Hebrew. It means God's joyful song. So rather than static like a statue, maybe God is more like a performing artist. When he stops singing, there's nothing there.
Yeah. No, that's a good analogy in the sense that God is active and alive and engaging us. And the more we try to put God in a box and make God static, the more we're diminishing the reality of that deity. Which, in some ways, I spend all my time working with Scripture. And if Scripture becomes something that you're trying to find definite answers to questions, it really diminishes that. It turns it into kind of an answer book, which is much more static than what I was referring to, just a genre of the parable. Really at the heart of, say, the Psalms or the parables or even the narratives is it's trying to engage us. It's trying to draw us in, where God has to be active now. It isn't something that God did way back when and set things up, but is present and engaging us in the process, which there's one fellow that has given a couple of talks, or he's now emeritus, Luke Timothy Johnson, he was teaching at Emory University in Georgia, but he wrote an article back in 2019 in Commonweal, which said, "Can we still believe in miracles?" And if we think of the last, since about 1800 on, that belief in miracles has been attacked by an intellectual tradition that thinks you're just buying into a superstitious worldview in which wishful thinking, I wish there'd be a miracle here, but you're just filling in the dots, and which would be in some ways you could call it, I'm sort of kidding myself or lying to myself about this. And so the miracles, that's just for individuals to sort of calm them down. And and that, where that it grew out of, probably an example that might help on that is there was a thinker who sort of started that whole tradition. I've been duped enough times that I am not going to accept anything unless I have subjected it to methodical doubt. So it's not just enough to get the facts, but if I can doubt it, then it's going to be, but that's sort of the human condition. We don't know everything. We're going to have missing pieces here. But he said there's one thing that I cannot doubt. I've gone through this exercise, Descartes, and he said, I can't doubt that I'm doubting. So I have to exist. So in that logical exercise, what he did then is he disconnected himself from everything. Everything else is subject to question. And so you live in this world in which most of your experience is something that's pretty, and his argument then was to live more honestly is that you really want to stay with this and make sure you bring forth the facts, which now obviously getting the data, the facts, we don't want to just fly off into an imaginative world that's just coming out of me and I'm reading it into everything else. But the way to solve that is not to trust in skepticism. It can't be that. I think the point about the way of knowing with others that's so important to every human life, that we put things together, that kind of knowing that comes, I can trust this person. I know who they are. I know how they act. It may come up and surprise me at a point, but I basically know what those kinds of that kind of interpersonal knowledge is what really is I would argue, is the stuff of our lives. And so the promises we make, that we do our level best to try and carry, that stabilizes our world so that if others around me are making important life decisions, that can be a kind of stable point that they can count on. I know you, and I know you're going to be there as best you can. And something may come along, but I know you're going to, and that's the kind of practical judgments. We need those promises. So if you look through our tradition, scriptural tradition, if God didn't make a promise to Abraham, make promise to the Israelites, etc., this thing would not have gone. And you have to trust in that. So you take risks on it. And you make the best decision you can at this point in time in light of those fixed points that stabilize things. And it all comes down to the integrity of the persons that are promising this in the process. So it's that kind of interpersonal knowing, or the reality of love, rather than following Descartes, who trusts in his capacity to ask questions and be really hard-nosed about what I'm going to accept. He trusts in skepticism. You've got to prove this to me before you're going to get a commitment out of me. By contrast, someone that is that we trust is in a loving relationship with us, we take wagers that, you know, I know you, and I know this is going to work out as high probability, the best that it, and that's how I live. I have to live with trust. I can't simply depend upon my control of other people, of every. So it's, again, going back to that whole question of, if you went back to the Garden of Eden, where's the real deficit there? And the misuse of human will in that situation was, I want to be in charge. I want to be in control. And control, as where it has an important element in our life, it can't be what stabilizes us. Trust, that's what faith is trust, basically. It's not, you know, faith may get articulated in creeds, etc., but at the heart of it is that relationship of taking risks and trusting in this deity, getting the engagement, because if we do that, we move and we're at a different place, and it stabilizes us at that point. Yeah, please.
Do you feel there's a lack of truth or trust that judgment day will come?
So that really it doesn't make any difference what we do. You know, it's we may think that there is, as you're saying, a judgment day in which there's accountability, etc. But actually, you know, this world that we're in, we see so many indications that it's a free-for-all. It's really chaotic. Well, the fancy label that scholars put on it, they call it nihilism, which means nothing. And what it comes down to is there aren't really, we have no indications in what we've experienced, how we've been formed, how we're raised, of values that should direct our lives, but it really doesn't matter. You know, it's all in the end, it's not going to make any difference. And I think the one place where I first ran into this was, I don't know if you've ever read Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. It's a huge book, but a wonderful book. But there's a character in there who's this skeptical intellectual called Ivan. And Ivan is really in his head. So he's trying to figure out, you know, how the world is organized, da, 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 da. And so he dredges up this example of innocent children who get fatal diseases. And he comes back and he says, you know, why would they get that? This doesn't make any sense. So he opts saying there can't be. And so that really his upshot of that is he starts telling others in the household that it doesn't matter, anything goes. You know, you can do whatever you want. So one of the servants kills off the father. And it's like his argument that anything goes, well, it doesn't matter anyway. You're going to be held accountable for it. And that is one of the pressing questions, I think, of our time, is sense that, as you articulated as, is there going to be a final judgment? Which, in other words, does it really make any difference what we do? In the end, we just die and we lapse into non-existence. So we ought to just live as best we can in the circumstances. This question, of course, has been around for ages and ages. And there's a wisdom book in the Hebrew scriptures called Koheleth or Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes is one of these. He's important for us because he asks all of those nasty questions. And he might appear to be extremely pessimistic about life and the world. But there's something realistic about where he tries to keep us from letting our imaginations fly away on us. And so he will say that, live more in the present moment, in the sense that, if you have some good things, material things, there are certain pleasures that are open to you, you should embrace that and live fully in that. And he will argue that those are gifts of God, and goes through about 11 chapters of really calling into question what would be a more, let's say, upbeat or optimistic sense of that you get when you read Proverbs. Proverbs is much more, it's parental wisdom. It's saying you sit at the feet of the parents, they give you the wisdom. And in essence, it's saying that 80–90% of the time, if you do what's right, it'll go well for you. If you don't, you're going to get punished. So you live out of that world in which that principle of this for that really works. And I think when we look at our own lives, that's where our values would come in. Does it really make any difference? Well, it does, because if I do what's wrong, I probably can count on it. I'm going to get it. It's going to come back. There's an ethical order within the world that was built into it by the Creator, and I have to pay attention to that, try and understand it as best I can. But the nihilists are coming back saying that's all coming out of somebody's imagination in the tradition. That ethical order of the world, it really does not exist. And so Koheleth, Ecclesiastes is important by saying there are experiences that would raise questions about that ethical world order. And so he, in a sense, he gets to the end of the book and he says that all of these scholars who spend all their time, he was in sort of wisdom schools where they thought and they teach students how to write and to think, etc. But when he got to the end of the book, he said, all of this trying to figure out the mystery of life or the order of the world, he says there are infinite number of books written on this, and all they do is they cause more trouble. You never really get to a clear conclusion. At that point, fear God, fear the Lord, and do as best you can what's right in that. So he goes back to the traditional sort of rule of life, but he also leaves us with the sense that, in terms of our being able to understand the mystery of evil, we really can't. We can't get through. But I think one thing that probably I paid more attention to as I've taught this last year is that his argument that we should live more fully in the present and what's given to us we should embrace is something that is probably most of us are aware of. Well, I have these good things, but I'm missing this. And so I spend more time thinking about what I'm missing. And I'm spending more time, I'll do this next week after, I'll plan for this, and it's all gonna, so I live more in the future than in the present, and I don't fully embrace what's here. And Koheleth is saying, forget it. You should be grateful for what you got and embrace that and live as best you can. And we hope it all, when we get to the end of this thing, hopefully we'll see that the journey between birth and death was worth it, that it was meaningful. And he really calls into question how meaningful life is, which is what that whole question about, is there a final judgment? If they're saying there isn't one, it's saying that really the meaning of life is pretty tenuous and maybe non-existent. There's no bigger fabric that we're living into. It's all something that's projected out of certain individuals, and others buy into this because of wishful thinking on their part. It looks like a good way to go, but Koheleth raises questions. So, you know, if I'm at that point in my life, I don't know if I'd read Koheleth if I'm in darkness, but it's good to at least be aware that you know, that voice, it didn't make it into sort of the authoritative canon of the tradition by accident. You might wonder how it got there, but there's a kind of realism about it that I think will connect up with our experience at times. But
Father, early in the talk, you mentioned that God is a person. And I'm thinking, okay, Jesus became human. What is person human? Are all humans persons, or?
yes, yeah, you know, anybody that carries a name, like maybe that's one way of getting at it, is a person. And so Jesus becomes human, and what we talk about, and this gets into the mystery of the Trinity, we talk about three persons in one God. So we don't depart from there's only one God, but we talk about the various roles or places of, and we use it with family language from that society, which is Father, Son, and Spirit. And each of those, as our tradition tried to articulate that mystery of God, said that each of those are persons, to try and give us a sense that they're agents. You know, each of them makes decision, does certain things, etc. So the primary one with God the Father is the creator, sort of the origin, the first principle. And then Jesus as the Son, being obedient to the Father, carrying this out. And the Spirit also gets the designation of being a person. So, yeah, Trinitarian language, it's fascinating, but it's also mysterious in a sense. Okay. But, all right, well, I think we have what, another hour, Grace, or is it not quite an hour? Oh, okay, well, we better move then. All righty. So, you know, I think the question, are there any other questions out there? I don't want to neglect what because for me, the interaction is the key part of all this. But anyway, okay, when I entitled this, it was Truth Telling and Prophecy and Testimony. And so we spent a fair amount of time, at least wandering around testimony as well as truth and telling the truth coming out of those Psalms, etc. But one of the books on the table out there is by Michael Casey, who's a Trappist monk, and he talks about humility as truthful living. And so what does it mean to be humble? And somehow, you know, keeping one's feet on the ground is crucial to this. And if I can find the excerpt from his text where he does refer to this, but he has a wonderful description of humility. And he says, humility, of course, comes from the Latin word humus, which means soil. And so we're down to earth. If someone is humble, they're down to earth. They're not alienated from themselves or their own person. And the person accepts, why was I born at this decade, at this time in history, with these set of parents and these siblings? It's why, and you simply, these are given, and you accept those things, and you're content to be who or what you are. Someone who's humble, rather than, God, I wish I was born into the Rockefeller family or something like this, but rather you accept, what's been handed on. And it goes further than that. It's total self-acceptance. There's no shame, no need for lies or evasions to inflate someone's own importance in the eyes of the people that are around them. And integral to this is you don't see others as competitors or rivals, which is so, you sort of see someone that you really look up to, and they do some, they're doing wonderful things, but do I rejoice in their gifts and the good things that they do? Or do I spend more of my energy wishing I were like that, and then either trying my best to imitate or do that, or feeling awful that I'm not like that and I don't measure up to that? No, but by contrast, the person that keeps their feet on the ground accepts what I've been given, etc. And so it's becoming content then with the limitations that are part of being human. We talk about being mortal. Mortality means is that we're finite. It clearly says we're going to die, but that means that all of the possibilities that are before me, I've had these, and as I grow older, I can do certain things, but I can't do what I did maybe a few. So the limitations that we are aware of, that is connected up with being creatures that are mortal and finite, and I accept that. And somehow, if we are grounded and accept who we are, what we've been given, etc., then when real difficult times come around, we probably are more stable and we can handle that kind of thing because we have both feet on the ground or whatever. We're more realistic about things. So Casey talks about humility as being a network of attitudes that stems or springs from a radical conversion of heart and signals a deep inner conformity to Christ. So in other words, from our tradition, being able to be humble and to be self-accepting and sort of going with that, that we need that presence of God that's interacting with us and giving us a sense that this is good, this is okay. Rather than, I had a good talk with someone here at the break who's reading this book, which I need to read, on Stoicism, because apparently there are a lot of spins on this that I wasn't picking up. I read a brief summary of the book. But usually when we say that someone is really stoical, say, for example, something bad happens to someone and you say, how did they hang in there with that? And they navigated through this. Some will say they have strong faith that I can warm up to. Some will say, well, no, they're just strong-willed. They can deal with disappointments, and that would be much more stoical. As I was growing up, I was probably, 7th, 8th grade when Kennedy was shot, and they had all of those images on TV of the funeral, et cetera, but they celebrated Jackie Kennedy as being quite, she wasn't emotional, seemed to be pretty stoical on that. But that's an example of, if you want to get a definition or at least a picture of stoicism, that would be it. That somehow it seems like a catastrophe that hits is not going to upend my life and put me into a real depression or whatever in the process. But by contrast, if we can put that contrast between being stoical in the way I've defined it as being in control of emotions, and the kind of stability that comes from, this is part of a bigger, the reason that I'm hanging in there is Christ. I see this, the suffering or the disappointment that I'm going through as part of sharing in the sufferings of Christ. Somehow I'm conforming to Christ in that process. That, to me, gives more meaning to those negative or disappointing experiences, as they're part of a larger reality that I'm being called to live into. So humility, I know some of my college buddies that I still hang around with, and coming out of the monastery, and we'll talk about how important humility is to it. He knows my history, and he knows that I've sort of tried to achieve this or achieve that. And so he really looks at me skeptically if I talk about humility. You must be kidding. You're really, it's deceptive. It's a way to distract me, and then you're going to move in there and take over this piece or whatever in that process. So I think humility is, if you have our feet on the ground and we're comfortable with where we are, which is a virtue that I think only comes with that striving for a kind of living relationship with Christ to keep me, the strength that I need in order to do that in the midst of all the things that would cause me to doubt and be anxious. And I need that presence of the divine to do this. So in that way, I can be honest about life and about myself in this, and not be trying to figure out how I can stem or keep away negative consequences within my experience. One fellow was talking at the break, mentioned about, and his description of how we were raised probably 20, 30 years ago is that, and maybe it still exists in the sense of we're sinners after the Garden of Eden story, etc., and that we should fear the final judgment. And therefore, what's important is that you simply put all of your energy into doing what's right and don't mess up. So you spend all of your time avoiding sin at that point, and you feel guilty when you've missed this, and you're really fearful that this God who's going to carry out the final judgment is going to be pretty harsh. So I better shape up. That picture, which, when you think about the original sin, Garden of Eden story, it's there in the tradition, but in the 17th, 18th century, there was almost a heretical branch that was called Jansenism that put all of the emphasis on that. And you can see how that robs us of the openness of the encounter of God being with us, trying to help us to be grateful for who we are. And it really goes contrary to humility in the sense that rather than this kind of movement towards total self-acceptance, it's being uncomfortable with the fact that I have things that are limits, or that I'm missing something, and that I stumble, and I spend all my time trying to be perfect. And so probably our whole practice of confession up through the generations, you quantify this, do this, do this, do this, this. Now, obviously, there's something important about knowing, giving a measure of things, so you keep doing this. If you do an exercise routine, if you do 10 push-ups, maybe that's better than 5. And if you don't count them, you probably don't do it in a consistent way. So there is something about measuring, but it doesn't really make sense in terms of trying to keep track on our behavior, the quality of our interactions with others, whether we're ethical or not. You do this, you keep track, but there's something bigger, and fundamentally it comes down to, we have one choice that we make. Do we choose life, or do we choose death? And where I used that example from Brothers Karamazov, in which this individual had argued himself into the corner where he said, nothing matters. It doesn't make any difference. So in effect, he was choosing death and not going the route of trusting that in spite of all of the things that don't connect, that really I have to wrestle with contradictions and confusion in my experience, instead of going that route, which leads to life, which is an openness and a yearning for this divine presence to come and nurture me, the alternative would be to say, forget it, this is not worth it, and you just shut it down. That's that one choice, choosing life over death, is something that in our life journey, we have to make that a number of times. It's not something that we do once for all. Hopefully we grow and are confident of this, of a choice for life. But so humility is a kind of basic goodness that says creation, God's creation is good. It's not something that's out there to trick us. What characterizes acceptance of my place, keeping my feet on the ground, is honesty, authenticity, and truth. So when Casey entitles his book Humility as Truthful Living, he's basically saying that's what humility is that you're paying attention to the truth about one's own life, about creation, and about what lies before me. So you try to stay with that kind of truthful living. But if we talk, I mentioned some of my old college classmates, they look at me skeptically if we start talking about humility. And somehow there's a sense that this is too passive. It doesn't really get to the heart of things. It's something that, when you preach humility, maybe you're trying, if you preach it, you need to, it's not good for some people that don't have voice, that need to stand up for themselves. And if you start saying you need to be humble, it's like you're pushing them towards passivity and not asserting themselves. But Gregory the Great, back in what, 5th, 6th centuries or around there, he was saying that for those temperaments that are not assertive, humility is actually good for them. Casey quoted that. I need to search that out to understand what he's trying to say there. But somehow our understanding of humility should include a wide range of temperaments, people that are more aggressive and people that are more passive, you might say. Some say that, well, if you embrace humility, you're just moving into old age way ahead of your time. I'm not sure. Anyway, the other thing is, is that trying to promote low self-esteem? And are you rejecting yourself and even moving into kind of self-hatred? But humility is a balance between what would be denying one's own ego, the I, who I am, and self-assertiveness. So it's that question of balance is so important. You know, I think when we move into Eastern traditions, of which I know enough to be dangerous, but it's where they try to wipe out or silence the I, and you move into this sort of being not being an individual, or you're merged into a larger reality. That's not our tradition, in which basically you want to find a balance between trying to control the ego or keep it in place and being self-assertive, that there's a place for that. Maybe that example I was using of the lament psalms, where we're given the legitimacy of going right out to God and complaining. And that there's something positive about that when we think of Job. I think in our own time, when we try to make sense out of the Holocaust, and you read Jewish writers like Elie Wiesel, and the question there that's very haunting is, where were you, God, when all of this was going on? And you know, it's a very challenging question, and intellectually, you know, trying to put this together, are we going to say at that point, well, really, God couldn't have done anything about this, so don't blame God? In our tradition, we don't want to go there. That's my argument. We do not want to go there. Rather, we want to, I would urge that we sort of step back and acknowledge our ignorance, or we just can't get our minds around that. But so in other words, is God in charge or capable of responding to brokenness and evil within the world? And is God loving? And where you get a real strong contradiction between that, we get confused. We recognize I can't quite understand this. And if it impacts me really strongly, those lament psalms and the example of Job is that you are supposed to go out there, and to sustain that relationship, connection with God, you shake your fist at God. God, I do not understand this. So you don't deny the confusion, the anger, and the pain that you're feeling, but you bring it into the conversation or the relationship with God, and actually, so when I try to, when that question comes up in discussions or in class or whatever about, well, how do you understand the Holocaust? And to me, the only way to respond to that is to say, you've got to be out protesting and directly saying it to God, because I can't, in terms of a system of thinking that tries to put all the pieces together, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. You end up with contradictions that are not to be brushed aside. So how do you stay with the contradiction without jettisoning the fact that I do believe there is a supreme being who is sovereign and compassionate? And that's what I want to hang on to. There are other, I think, process theology and a lot of thought about evolution and why is suffering. There are a lot of dead ends. If God's in charge of this whole evolutionary process, why do you end up with centuries where these animals or this being, and there's a lot of suffering that goes on because it doesn't seem to be very well directed. It seems to be more, these things emerge, and then by chance over time you get this new development, etc. The religious question that comes up in that is, what does this say about suffering? Suffering, I think, when it's come up here in some of our ways about how important suffering is for human growth, etc., that I think a Christian way of approaching the whole issue of evolution is that suffering is part of this in terms of the development and growth. It is part of creation. But process theology tries to say that because it seems to be so inefficiently or awkwardly directed, that God really is not sovereign over this process of evolution, that things are emerging by chance, just given so much time, this emerged from that. That kind of backing off from God's power or sovereignty, that's a step I won't go. Because if I can't appeal to God as someone who's capable of doing something about the situation in my experience, then God is not God. You know, it may be consoling that God feels bad for me and wants to share in that suffering. But that still is a reduction of what our tradition talks about as God. God is the creator. God, and even in certain places, I think the question, does God know what's going to happen 10 years from now? Does God know how my life is going to end up? There we're getting to the edges of what we can understand. But I think I would put it together this way, that God does know, but somehow, and this seems contradictory, but somehow God knows, but God wants me to choose, and that my choosing could go this way or that way, and that's important to the integrity of who I am as a person. If I'm not free, if I'm just determined, that undercuts the integrity of being a free being. And my love is not really love because it's not freely chosen. So somehow to navigate, that's at a point where how that piece fits together is a mystery. I just can't, that piece doesn't quite fit, but I will not, personally, I will not let go of the fact that God is sovereign. To me, that's over intellectualizing our understanding of life. And life is suffused with mystery. which means, doesn't mean that we don't know things, but we have the way we understand and know in a mystery is that we're living in it, and we keep engaged with it and try to understand and live with this. The kind of knowing is not just conceptual, logical, in that sort of linear logic, but it's a kind of knowing in our personal. We know things intuitively in the process of that. So the question of suffering, it's the mystery of suffering, mystery of evil within human experience. We'll never crack that, I think, conceptually. If we do pretend, we probably reduce the reality of who God is in order to make it comprehensible in the process. So being truthful about our own experience and truthful about God. And so as Casey says, truth-filled living is the soul of humility. It's an attitude of realism. It's a respect for the nature of things. And it's a reluctance to force reality to conform to our own individual or subjective factors within ourselves. So if we have our feet on the ground, we recognize I'm not divine. If I'm going to be divinized, that's something that God does to me. But me, I'm mortal, I'm human. But if we do pretend to be sort of divine apart from God, Casey says we demand a high level of pleasure, total freedom, power, a good reputation, and complete absence of irritants, and we want them right now, which I found to be an interesting way of putting this together. We demand from others around us to give us what they can't give, and we resent them for this. We expect too much from ourselves, and we get upset or disappointed about our own contingent goodness and zeal for. So this discontent and zeal for self-improvement are signs of pride, the opposite of keeping our feet on the ground. So the need to accept the fact that we are human, what goes with that of being a creature is that we're related to the Creator. And so we're radically dependent upon God. All that we have comes from God. And our deepest spiritual experience is to feel that utter dependence on God and to want to submit ourselves to the divine will. And there's a line in Psalm 34:5 in which, you think of going into sort of prayer in which you're trying to just be before God. That psalm says, we look upon God and we become radiant. That somehow this looking upon the face of God impacts us and brings us into union with that God. If you recall that, there's a wonderful old episode it's in Exodus 34, where Moses has been up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and he comes down and the people are all afraid of him because his face is radiant, is the way it's typically. And so when he goes out to be among the members of the community in daily life, he's got to put a mask on so that they don't see that, and then they can bear to be around him. But when he goes in to speak with God face to face, he takes that off, and God's putting the divine reality is infusing that into that embodied Moses that he then moves on with, which I think is, when we ask the question, what am I going to be like after death? You know, what are we like? And the letters of John talk about, we don't really know, but we do know that when we look upon God, we shall become like God. So there's, in the ancient imagination, which I am drawn towards in this, is that what we look upon somehow becomes part of us. And we become transformed by this kind of looking upon God, we become like God in the process. So if that helps to sort of spur on anyone to try and spend more time in this kind of silent contemplative prayer, what we're doing is we're trying to get into the depths of our being, in which our belief is that Christ is there. In all of our busyness, in all of our moving here and there, trying to get control over this, or at least do this or do that, we don't take the time to settle into that and to encounter that reality of Christ, of God that's there. But it resides in everyone. It's just a matter of paying attention and trying to get into that depth. So Casey goes on and he says, we are sinners. So we will probably be haunted by past sinfulness and selfishness, and see ourselves as resisting God and hostile to others. So he says you have to be realistic about that reality of sin that's hidden below the surface of our well-meaning lives. And he says at this point, he tries to, this may be a sort of intellectual distinction, but he says it's more, sin here is a theological reality rather than experience of personal guilt. And what that means is the kind of sin that's going to determine my route in life is a preference. If I choose death, it's a preference for evil over goodness. It's a turning away from God, a God who's really seeking us out and trying to be in relationship with us. Psalm 139 in our office book in the Abbey, at least in the earlier version of it, it was entitled "The Hound of Heaven," which I kind of liked in the sense that it's a sort of anxious God or anxious dog, which is loving and going after and just trying to get your attention and draw you into this reality of love, which is there. So sin then is the turning away from that God who wants to be in relationship with us. And Casey then goes on and he says, we are stalled out as human beings. Oftentimes our woundedness can keep us from moving forward. Maybe the stalling out is we just haven't realized our potentialities. We may use former unfairness as an excuse to refuse the demands of the present. And here he's kind of, I'm not sure, I would be careful about this, but he says victims are often notoriously insensitive to the hurt they inflict on others. Now I want to be careful with that, but in a sense, is there a tendency when we are victimized to just so turn into on ourselves that we can't somehow take that step of saying that if I'm going to move forward positively, I have to decide to do that. There's a certain taking responsibility that's important. And I think some people that have been working in trauma theory, which has influenced a lot of Old Testament work, and I've spent some time, as Grace, when you introduced me, said he's working on this commentary on Ezekiel, which I will be working on till I'm 6 feet under. But, but Ezekiel is trying to deal with an audience of Jerusalem was totally destroyed in 587, and there were deportations 10 years prior to that. And these people that lost everything, and they were put in another country, etc. They're trying to say that our God, the Lord Yahweh, who's protecting us, is still with us, and is the reason this happened was not because he couldn't have protected us. And in fact, he brought these conquering Babylonians in to punish us for our really going off the rails. And we were in bad shape. And the only way to correct this was this dramatic intervention, which ended up destroying the temple. What's the upshot of going through that kind of experience is that he gets to chapter 18 and he's pointing towards the fact that each of us as individuals can choose to turn back to this God. I don't know how, if we put Job in that group and we have Ezekiel preaching to him. Ezekiel is preaching basically, if you repent and come back, God will do something new for you. But trauma theorists are saying that once we do try and say, it does make a difference what I do, that my choices will shape the future going forward. You get a sense of agency back into, and in Ezekiel's case, he was saying you need to acknowledge that somehow you're part of that larger web of turning away from God, and accept responsibility, and then choose to go forward. And then something new can happen in the process. So it's that, where I was going with that is the sense, and I do this with great trepidation. I'm probably stomping on things that are much more complicated. But his sense is that victims can just stall out, and that stalling out and just staying in that can then impose real burdens on the people they live with. And that somehow there needs to be some way that they can move beyond this. And it's not, according to that prophet, it's not going to happen unless you choose. It's a choice that the individual still has. So no matter how much we are crushed and controlled, etc., by outside powers, that choice, that fundamental choice for life or for death, still is there with us. Humility then joins us with the rest of the human race. Solidarity, communion, compassion. It's pride that causes us to think that we are not like others, sort of like the Pharisee who's up in the temple praying. I'm not like all the others. It's these, and you have the other fellow in there that's on his knees, repenting, etc. Okay. So that kind of honesty that goes with humility is so important. Let's see here. So one other piece, as long as I was in, my title said I was going to deal with not only with testimony and truth-telling, but also with prophecy. And prophecy is probably something that, you know, we may think of someone being a sort of prophetic voice, but usually it's someone who we sense has really studied out the lay of the land and has done, and they make intelligent decisions on the basis of what they've analyzed. Old Testament prophets, they did diagnose the ills of their society, but they also made statements that are just they come out of their minds and their hearts, and that they've been intuitively somehow inspired to say these things by the divine. And here's where you might get into this question of, if I follow this prophet, am I being duped? You know, what's the basis? They're wishful thinking. They're just trying to deceive me, or it's not truthful. How do I know? And if you ask them what the claims they're making, if you ask them to, well, bring forth the data that's going to help me, then that doesn't fit into the paradigm of what a prophet is saying something that is not based upon an empirical, you get, like you're from Missouri, give me the facts, and all the facts lead me to this. You can gather up all the facts, but you can't draw that conclusion. There's a leap there, which we're saying it's an intervention of God inspiring this person to speak a message, either of challenging them to change course, or even more importantly, challenging them to have hope and to lead them forward. So if I mention the prophet Ezekiel, I would bet if I went around here, and I'm not going to do that, but if I asked you, when you hear the prophet Ezekiel, what images come to mind my sense is that probably most would come up with dry bones. And you get the rattling of these bones, and they get reconstructed and they come back. That passage is, the dry bones is an image of this community that's been displaced and are in exile. And you read along in chapter 37, and it says, we are these dead bones. We have no life in us at all. And so this inspired vision is trying to say that God has other plans for you who are displaced from your land, etc. But he tells the prophet, speak to these bones. So there's something about the word that is being expressed to these once upon a time creatures that could hear. I don't know how they hear at this point, but anyway, it does impact those bones. And the life starts to come into them to where they reassemble into what would be like mannequins or statues that you see, but they're lifeless at that point. And so he gets commanded to speak once more, and speak to it's like the ruach, or the wind or the spirit that comes from four directions all at once, which obviously that challenges our imagination to have the wind coming from east, north, south, and all at once converging there. So we're looking beyond towards a reality that it's capsulized in this term, in Hebrew it's ruach, which means wind or breath. So it's meteorological, or it's anthropological, like we breathe in and breathe out. But then it goes to a more spiritual level, to where ruach also gets translated as spirit. And all three of those come together in that vision, in which as the prophet prophesies first, then you get the coming together of the skeletons, and then the body reassembling at that point, but then says it again, and you get the life force coming into these creatures. But it's being mediated to them through the word. And that's so important to our whole tradition. When you think of Jesus as being the Word of God that comes in, and there's something about the language and that capacity of language to connect us with this larger reality. And so speaking these words, these solemn words to this situation, creates an imagination, a vision of hope that they are going to go back to their land and get restored. And there may even be some hints, certainly when you get around the time of Christ, they're thinking of the resurrection of individuals that have passed on. So it's the power of that word, which is solemnized. It's a word that's coming from God. But even when we think of language, the words we speak to one another has a real impact on whether we're building them up, tearing them down, encouraging them or not. So language in itself has a real creative power to it, or destructive, depending on what we do with it. But in that, when you think about prophecy, then a true kind of prophecy that comes from God can shape the imaginations in which we live, and therefore can really take us forward. So it's not only the promises that God has made or the promises that others have made that give us a sense of stability of the life of which we're part, but it's also these prophetic ones that draw us into a bigger world at that point. So the question of Ezekiel wrestled with the fact that there were other prophets that were saying things that Jerusalem had not yet been fully destroyed. They'd had an invasion, but some of the prophets whom he labels as false prophets were trying to say, oh, things are going to be okay. Wholeness and peace is here. Just calm down and stay with it. And the people that were doing okay in Jerusalem wanted to hear that. Even some of the exiles who thought, well, we're going to go back and there will be a restoration, wanted to hear that. But his radical vision of we have to go through this full death experience was something that had to hold their feet to the fire. But so the question of false prophecy, we have no way of really sorting out these realities. And I probably in our own time, we have a much more subdued sense of how prophecy operates. But I would argue that we still are paying attention to how is God speaking to us now in our lives, in our experience? How is God speaking to us in our country? How is God speaking to us through the pandemic? Or is that this just happened? God didn't have anything to do with it. Or is there some kind of message there that's trying to give us a wake-up call to where we're headed, what we're up to? Is there something more to it? And obviously, because of you can get all kinds of subjective, I project my interpretation out on that, and I can't verify it, but there's a certain danger in that, but I think the question is important. How is God operative in that current circumstance? The polarization within our country, in our church, what's the message there? What do we, is somehow there's a need to see how God is speaking to us through those experiences. As I mentioned that, the whole Babylonian exile, which is a catastrophe that came on them, was Ezekiel just reading into that? maybe it was just the Babylonian armies were more powerful, and you can size it up. That's why the temple was destroyed. But Ezekiel says, oh, wait a minute. This didn't just happen because God turned away and let everything go, but he actually called them in to do this because we needed a wake-up call in that. So I want to be cautious, but is there a wake-up call coming in our own times? I don't know, but it's worth thinking about to see if there's something bigger in all of this. So prophetic word, prophecy, trying to call us to live in a world in which God is a serious player in our individual lives, our family lives, in our communities, in our nation. Americans, with good reason, separated church and state. But as a matter of fact, the two cannot be completely separated, because we're dealing with the reality of power and security. And if those concerns, if we bracket out the divine, the sense of balance in what we do is always going to be, it's going to be tenuous. Or you think back to mutually assured destruction back as a deterrent strategy and nuclear. How many times do you have to be able to destroy the world in order to, anyway, there was no way to say enough force is enough to secure us. You got into that model, and it seemed like more was needed. And probably the same thing happens with us in terms of where we feel vulnerable and try to get security. How much is enough? And that whole question of the force or the power that's going to be able to secure us is, if God is not a serious player in that, if we don't allow trust in God, we will probably find ourselves over-investing in this, or an imbalance comes into the way we do this. So, when I think back to some of the materials that at least an outline, I think, came through, which I have departed from and tried to dance around through all of this. But one of the texts that I kept referring to was Proverbs. And Proverbs is trying to say that what's most important for us is having good judgment. We look at the people before us, we listen to them, we listen to our own selves. We try to take all the particularities that are before us that we can be attentive to. And if we have an important decision to make, we're not going to have totally convincing evidence that we should go this way or that way. But we get to a certain point and we make our best judgment and we go with it, which is what a kind of practical judgment or practical wisdom is about. And the ancients, Aristotle in particular, which then influenced all of sort of Christian ethical thinking up through the Middle Ages and beyond, was this sense of prudential judgment or discernment. The rule of Benedict, it's balance. How do you balance this off against that? How do you maintain and move through this? And to do that has to be discerning. We're monarchically organized. We have an abbot, but if that abbot is not listening to the individuals in front of him to make decisions, and he makes decisions, I have this much, I understand you, and I understand this, and try to urge one to go in one direction or the other, he's making his best judgment on not a complete, but as best as he can at that point. And you have to trust then in the honesty, the uprightness, the well-intention of leaders. And that's how the whole thing works. If you don't have that kind of integrity in the decision makers, which we're all decision makers, but if you don't have the integrity in it, everything falls apart and goes south. So if what I've been disturbed about, and I assume most people are disturbed about when we think of national life and what you can get away with, and so you lie and you do this or do, how would, you know, that it's like you blame others for things that aren't quite coming out right. And blaming others really started in Garden of Eden. Stumbled. What's the first thing God comes out and he says, where are you? You ate that fruit, didn't you? So Adam says, well, she gave it to me. She said, well, the serpent told me to do it. So it's that kind of tendency when we're put under scrutiny or whether, and we feel guilty, we try to find excuses and pass the blame on to others. Humility is being honest and self-acceptance in that, which then if we're living in this way, we're going to make judgments along the way that really build up the common good in the process. How do you, to me, that's the only way you get this reality called common good. It depends on the integrity of the people and their commitment towards doing what's good for in solidarity with others. And I recall one of our profs here, who was a great fellow. And I started talking in a discussion, started talking about common good. He says, well, who's common good? So his sense was, we really can't talk about that because the subjective reading into that, we're not going to agree. We're just going to, and you see in some ways, this, I'm giving you all my political analysis here, which is probably not good, but the polarization that we have now is, this is how I read it, and I'm in this camp, you're in that camp, and that's where our identity comes from, at least in this sphere. So we polarize in order to find our place. Whereas the real challenge is to find commonality. If it's common good, where is our solidarity in all of this? Which Abbot John challenged us all in the community a couple months ago by saying that we really have to listen deeply, and to people that we might disagree with right off the bat, you have to listen to where they're coming from. So anyway, truth-telling, testimony, and prophecy. And I think, Grace, am I out of time? I saw you stand up. That probably tells me that okay, that's fine. Sure, happy to. I think I've worn them out at this point. Okay. We've reached absolute truth, I think, on this.